Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, our Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast for April. And we have a great program for you here. We live in interesting times, and from the Washington Times this morning is a very interesting and sobering article. The headline on the front page is "Foundation Cash Funds Anti-War Movement." I suppose we should have figured this out, that the activities that you see, anti-war activities, are not just spontaneous demonstrations, but turns out that the left-wing foundations have been getting an immense influx of cash, which they are using to considerable publicity, if not considerable effect, on the policy of the United States. But some of the organizations that the article talks about, and I commend it to you, suggest you read it, is an outfit called Code Pink. Then there's the Institute for Policy Studies, which has a $2.2 million budget for 2003 provided by the Turner, Ford, MacArthur, and Charles Stewart Mott Foundations. Then there's the TrueMajority.com, an internet activism group founded during the summer by Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. And then there's San Francisco-based Tides Foundation that has given $1.5 million to anti-war efforts since September 11th. And Win Without War drummed up $1 million in support. MoveOn.org raised $3.5 million, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me that the left understands the importance of supporting activities to a greater extent than many of us who are conservatives. It happens that virtually every conservative nonprofit organization has, in the last 2 years, suffered a decline in revenue. I know of one or two exceptions, and as you all probably know, I'm on a number of different boards and have trained people in most of the conservative organizations and have considerable knowledge of it. And I can only think of a couple of exceptions that revenue for conservatives has gone down as the economic circumstances in the country are down. But the interesting, very interesting, the revenue for organizations on the left is going up. In 2003, to date, the Leadership Institute has trained 1,307 students in 47 of our schools. We have placed 14 job seekers through our employment placement program to date. You have before you on the table our 2002 school schedule. I urge you to take a moment and review the calendar, and considering attending one of our 2003 seminars or suggesting those seminars to conservatives whom you know. To lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance and offer an invocation, it's my pleasure to present Rich Westfall. Rich is a native of the Buckeye State and an alumnus of Ashland University in Ohio, where he studied broadcast technology and public affairs. While still in school, he worked as an on-air news talent for the radio station in Worcester, as well as doing freelance reporting for USA Radio Network. Following his graduation from college, he moved to the nation's capital to work for the 24-hour public affairs television channel America's Voice, and while at that station he worked his way through the ranks, starting in the technical arena and advancing to the production side. His final credits included launching and producing the simulcast of the Michael Reagan talk show and booking guests for Paul Wyrick's daily Direct Line program. Currently, Rich is the Director of Graduate Development for the Center for Print and Broadcast Media here at the Leadership Institute. Rich heads up a placement service for media professionals and is working to transform the industry by bringing up a network of resources from various media-related and culture-shaping fields. Rich, would you come up with the invocation and pledge?
Please join me in prayer. Most gracious God and Heavenly Father, we come before you today asking that a spirit of humility be released in us. We recognize our dependence on you for every heartbeat and every breath we take. We acknowledge how easy it is for us to go wayward and become idolatrous. We often seek the temporary gain of this life over the eternal purpose you give us. Have mercy on us. We ask that you would grant direction to those who are in positions of authority and public service, especially in this difficult time. May your wisdom be with those that lead this country. We ask that you make their hearts attentive to the spirit of truth so that they may do what is right in your sight. Let their examples illuminate a path for those they lead. Let America shine as a city on a hill. Guide us toward greater virtue and towards your perfect character so that we might be a light to the world. May your spirit unleash a more complete sense of liberty, justice, honor, sacrifice, charity, virtue, and peace. We now ask your blessing on this gathering, the food to our nourishment, the people, the conversation, the words spoken, and the action we take following this meeting. And we ask this in the name of the most honorable and precious name in the universe, Jesus Christ. Amen. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks a lot, Rich. Let me point out that while revenues have been down, the Leadership Institute, I believe, set an all-time record for school enrollment in the first quarter of 2003, and that record is in no small measure attributable to the department where our next speaker works. He's the Director of Coalitions for our Grassroots Activist School here at the Institute, and here Ty helps train thousands of conservative activists to become more effective. In the fall of 2002, Ty was deployed by the Republican National Committee's 72-hour task force to work on Mike Rogers' targeted congressional race in the 3rd District of Alabama. Prior to joining the Leadership Institute, Ty worked for the George Landreth for Congress campaign in Virginia's 4th Congressional District. He worked as Landreth's assistant. He also worked on Ollie North's 1994 Senate campaign and did campaign work with George Allen when he was governor of Virginia. While attending Hampton-Sydney College, Ty used techniques he learned at the Leadership Institute's Youth Leadership School to become student government president. Ty grew up in Charlottesville and is a graduate of Hampton-Sydney. Ty?
Before I get to introduce our speaker this morning, I'd like to have Josh Mercer come up and give us a report on the Student Publications School. If you give us a quick report, then I'll be more than happy to introduce our guest speaker this morning.
Thanks, Ty. Last year at the Student Publications School, we were able to train 136 students at 24 different colleges across the country. And I just want to tell you, we were able to, from that training, help start up 14 independent conservative newspapers last year. Let me just give you an idea of what we were able to do with that last year. 2 students who came to our school last year, through the support of donors from the Leadership Institute, we were able to train Joshua Claiborne, who was a student at the University of Indiana. He started an online publication, went back to his university, and was able to stop a very liberal anti-war resolution from passing the Student Senate at the University of Indiana. We also helped start up independent newspapers that are in the print format as well, which is what which happens at most of the universities. We helped start up a newspaper at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania within the last 2 years, and that newspaper wrote an editorial about free speech, which defended even unpopular speech. Now, universities today, we find a lot of speech codes, and the defense of the First Amendment is not a common occurrence in the university. And the university held a forum based on this editorial talking about free speech at Bucknell University. And they brought in the staff members from the Bucknell University newspaper, Counterweight. And they held a meeting. And at this meeting, the conservative editors of this newspaper were lampooned and embarrassed and ashamed, and actually were threatened with violence. And they ended up leaving the meeting, and administrators sent out a campus-wide email saying the Counterweight, quote, caused a number of students, including international students, to feel abused. Another classic example of trying to stifle debate. Now, in journalism, I don't know if you know about this, there's a phrase to say that when a dog bites a man, it's not really a news story. My dad works for the Postal Service. He can tell you it happens a lot for people who deliver the mail. But if a man were to bite a dog, now that would be a story. And in fact, it was. We helped start a newspaper at Berkeley 3 years ago called the California Patriot. And to have a very conservative newspaper at a very, very liberal university, well, that's just a story of man bites dog. And it made Time magazine. These students made Time magazine. Another student that was trained this past year at the Student Publication School, his name is Igor Berman. He went back to his University of California, Davis. He thought, I want to get involved in journalism, so he started writing for the mainstream newspaper. Mainstream, I use that kind of loosely because most mainstream college newspapers are left of the Pravda. He started writing for the newspaper. He got a contract to write a year worth of editorials. And then the newspaper fired him for being conservative. So what did he do? He used his training from the Leadership Institute and the financial support that donors help us provide, and he started his own newspaper called Liberty Flame. So now students at UC Davis will get a defense of conservative values. And so that's what I want to leave you with today. At the Leadership Institute, we don't just write about the defense of conservative values. We do help these students write about conservative values. But we also get them active, working in their student government, writing articles that are printed in the newspaper, and yes, even getting publicity from Time magazine. So there you go. Thank you, and I'm going to bring Ty back up here to introduce your speaker. Thanks so much.
Good morning. I just want to thank Naomi Egerton for putting together a great breakfast this morning. We've got plenty of people here this morning. We've got a great speaker, so I'm excited about Tucker come up here to speak here in a few moments. But just wanted to let y'all know, I guess I started wearing a bow tie about in 8th or 9th grade. And it wasn't always the most popular thing, but I always loved bow ties, right? And used to get weird looks from girls from time to time. But since Tucker's been battling the left on TV and doing a great job of battling two of the best spinmeisters on CNN's Crossfire, he battles Paul Vigala and Carlson all the time. I mean, I think the bow tie is becoming much more popular. And in fact, last summer I was at a meeting at the National Press Club, and as I was leaving with some friends, there was a huge line of young ladies waiting outside the press club, and as I was walking by, they kept saying, "Is that Tucker? Hey, is that Tucker?" and I kept walking. I think my head got about that big, and I just kind of kept walking. Then finally, 3 or 4 of them came up, saying, "Hey, can we have your autograph? Can we get your picture?" And I was just laughing because it's so funny. I enjoyed the moment, my brief moment in the spotlight for a few seconds, but then I had to break their hearts and tell them that no, I'm not Tucker Carlson. I'm Ty Bales, and they're like, okay, that kind of busted their bubble. But anyways, it's a pleasure. It's a great honor to have Tucker Carlson here this morning. Another bow tie wearer, the famous bow tie wearer in American politics. Tucker graduated from Trinity College, and he got his start writing for the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. He's written for, done a great job writing for many famous publications. He's seen Weekly Standard, Reader's Digest, GQ, Wall Street Journal, you name it. Tucker's written there, and he's probably most well known for his battling on CNN's Crossfire, where he weekly debates Vigala and Carville, two of the best spinmeisters in the country. And he also appears weekly on Inside Politics with Judy Woodruff, and he was a co-host of CNN's Spin Room. But it's my honor and pleasure to introduce Tucker Carlson.
Oh, good morning. Thank you. It's nice to hear nice words about bow ties. I've never met a woman I'm not married to who likes them, so I don't actually believe you. But I appreciate the compliments. Anyway, and thank you also, the Leadership Institute, for your work fighting fascism on college campuses, and particularly for funding conservative publications, which, as a former college student, I can tell you what you already know, and that is that they just play a huge role in providing the voice of good sense on campus. And it's just striking to me that it falls to small, relatively marginal publications like that, some of which I wrote for when I was in college, to defend the First Amendment. It's shocking, but I think you're absolutely right. That is true. So I'm grateful to be here. Thank you. Not that you had much choice, because every other journalist in Washington is no longer in Washington, but abroad, including all my friends. I think I'm the only one left. And unfortunately, in Kuwait and Iraq, everyone now has satellite modems, so they can email me and make me feel even worse. There are a bunch of guys from the Weekly Standard there. Unfortunately, Kuwait, as you probably know, is a dry country because it adheres to Sharia law, to Islamic law. And most journalists, obviously, are alcoholics, so this is a huge problem, as you may know. And I just got an email this morning from one of my closest friends who works at the Weekly Standard, who will remain nameless, Matt Labash, and who shows up in Kuwait with like 19 quarts of Listerine, actually Scotch, but in Listerine bottles, which he kind of sneaks through. And he just told me that Christopher Hitchens, a longtime man of the left, writer for The Nation magazine, who has had this kind of late-life conversion and become very conservative, conservative enough that he's an inspiration to me, and I'm about the most conservative person I know, so that tells you something, shows up. And being an English journalist, he's, he's like an ordinary journalist, except more so. So anyway, Labash was telling me in his email this morning that, there's nothing after a long day of covering a war than sitting back with a long, cool glass of Listerine. So they're sitting enjoying their Listerine cocktails, he said, and the woman comes in to change the bed linen and sort of looks at them in this sort of disapproving way, and Labash explains that they both have just terrible cases of gingivitis and that they need to do this. Anyway, so I'm sad not to be there hoisting a glass of Listerine in support of our troops. The two things I think we've learned so far in the war, and it's not, I don't think it's, much about the war is unclear at this point. Sort of like the famous Ho Chi Minh quote when asked, what are the effects of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too soon to tell. I think in many ways that applies to this war. But the two things that strike me about it right off the top, Saddam Hussein would not have been disarmed by sanctions. I think that's absolutely clear, no matter what side of this you come down on. I think if you believe that disarming Saddam Hussein is a priority and important, and not everybody does, but if you do, you have to admit that he was never going to be disarmed short of force. That if Saddam Hussein is not giving up in the face of 100,000, 300,000, but 100,000 in Iraq, American soldiers, he was probably not going to be cowed into giving up his weapons of mass destruction by, say, Hans Blix or Mohammed al-Baradei. Probably would not intimidate Saddam into giving up his anthrax. So I think we all need to admit that, again, if the goal was to disarm Saddam Hussein, force was the only course. The second thing I think people need to admit, particularly those on the left need to admit, is that this was not a political decision on the part of the president going to war. Often in the lead-up, in the months leading up to this, on our show, on Crossfire, you heard Democrats say, well, this is all political. This is Karl Rove's, the president's chief political advisor's, diabolical attempt to draw attention away from a weakening economy. Let's have a war so nobody will notice that Social Security's not properly funded and the stock market's down, et cetera, et cetera. You actually heard otherwise intelligent people make this claim. I thought it was ludicrous at the time. It's totally unsupportable at this point for this reason. It's not at all clear that the war is going to be good politically for this president, at all. If you watch the coverage or read the paper for 5 minutes, you get a sense of all the many things that could go wrong, up to and including the use of chemical weapons against American troops, but also what is clearly going to be a somewhat protracted siege of Baghdad. How is that good politically for the president? Well, the short answer is it's not, and it could be terrible. In fact, he could lose his presidency over it. So I think the left, I think the country needs to admit and say out loud that the president is acting out of principle. It may not be a principle everyone agrees with, but I think he at very least needs to get credit for acting against his own political interests in really an act of courage, in my opinion. Because again, this could destroy his presidency. And I think even some conservatives, me included, have trouble admitting that. You know, because those of us who support the war and think it was a good idea, I think instinctively believe it ought to be axiomatic that some political benefit arises out of that. But that doesn't always happen. Churchill lost in 1945. People sort of forget that. Simply because you do the right thing doesn't mean you're going to be reelected. Karl Rove knows that. The advisors around the president know that. And I think no sane political advisor would counsel this or any other president to enter a war like this for political reasons. So basically everything in American politics, in my opinion, from now until the 2004 election is going to be predicated or at least influenced by the war in Iraq, which means it's going to be a very strange election year, even weirder than they normally are. And elections are generally, you know, they're generally weird, which is why we love them in cable news. Because every election is sort of this weird combination of the Olympics and, I don't know, Christmas and like a Grateful Dead show, right? Because they, you know, it requires incredible endurance. There's this massive payoff at the end, and the experience draws, you know, every lunatic from within about a 500-mile radius to the scene of the event. And if you don't believe me, you should read my email inbox, which is cluttered with emails from the Al Sharpton for President campaign, which has been inviting me day after day, week after week, to join candidate, the Reverend Sharpton, as he tours Iowa. This, in my opinion, not to digress, but this is really one of the great developments of the last 20 years, the Al Sharpton for President campaign, mostly because, as I try to point out every single night on Crossfire, Al Sharpton is the physical embodiment of the values of the Democratic Party. And it's bad for Democrats. I don't think Democrats have thought this through. Al Sharpton is a much tougher, I'll just give you one example. Is a much tougher competitor than people realize. We had Al Sharpton on Crossfire last summer on the very day that the Al Sharpton drug tape came out. I'm not sure if anybody here saw it. It's a sort of remarkable. We were the first show to air it. It's a undercover surveillance tape taken of Al Sharpton about 15 years ago by the DEA. And I watched it right before the show to get some sense of what it was like, and it was horrifying. It was like this black and white, grainy, abscam-like footage. There's Al Sharpton sitting in a small room across from an undercover DEA agent. Sharpton's wearing a cowboy hat, a leather jacket, cowboy boots, smoking a cigar, feet up on the desk. He's talking about kilos. I looked at this tape and I thought, you know, if that was me on the tape, you know, I would do the honorable thing and kill myself, because there's no way to explain your presence in a tape like this. So we invite Al Sharpton on, roll the tape. I'm watching him through the monitors or rolling his tape. He doesn't even wince. And I didn't even bother to ask a main question. Because the tape itself was so devastating. I said, Mr. Sharpton, how do you respond to this tape? He didn't miss a beat. He said, well, where's the second tape? And my first thought was, I'm going to kill my producer. He didn't tell me about the second tape. But I said, Mr. Sharpton, we're not here to talk about the second tape. We're here to talk about this tape. And I want to know how you respond to this tape. Quite a damning tape. And he said, you haven't seen the second tape, have you? And I said, again, Mr. Sharpton, sweating by this point, if you could just respond to this tape. He said, well, how do you expect me to respond to the first tape if you don't even have the second tape? You haven't even seen the second tape. You don't have the second tape in your possession, and you're asking me to comment on the first tape. I'm not going to do that if you don't have the second tape. And I realized about an hour later driving home, you know, there is no second tape. Obviously. But the point is, and this was the great part, the point is that in about 7 seconds, Sharpton had changed the topic of the show, which, needless to say, was why is Al Sharpton caught on videotape talking to an undercover DEA agent about kilos of cocaine? That was our preferred topic. To his preferred topic, which is, why is the federal government conspiring to set up a powerful leader like Al Sharpton? It was remarkable. And it was that moment I thought, you know, the Democratic Party's going to have trouble with this guy. I mean, he could roll into Boston, into the Democratic Convention in Boston next August, with delegates, which he will then parlay into a primetime speaking role at the Democratic Convention. So you're going to have Al Sharpton addressing America from the podium at the Democratic National Convention. It's a very long way of saying there is something to look forward to. Okay? And I should say at the outset that I'm such a supporter I'm sort of an informal advisor to the Sharpton for President campaign. I expect to be a head of Amtrak, if not Secretary of Agriculture, when he wins. It's a great thing. Anyway, sorry, not to get into that. But look, the point is that the campaign is going to be I believe, much harder to gauge than the last one. I mean, all campaigns are difficult to gauge and difficult to predict. I lost a huge amount of money on the. I really believed that Phil Gramm was going to be president. I think Mrs. Gramm and I were the only people who believed that. When he said, "Can an ugly man be elected president?" I thought, yes. No is the answer. But anyway, but all of them are difficult to gauge and difficult to predict. This more than any other, and there are a number of reasons for that. As I said, the war, but I think a deeper sort of structural reason why this is going to be a weird campaign is because politics really has changed since September of 2001. That's an obvious point. Books are being written on this right now. It's not clear really how the country has changed, and again, it's going to take decades to sort of come to a real understanding of how. But let me just suggest one important way I think politics really is different, and I'll illustrate it with a poll, much as I dislike polls, but this actually is an interesting poll. It's something called the Customer Satisfaction Index. And some of you who are in business may actually use this. It's a massive survey of consumers. It's about 50,000 consumers surveyed every quarter, so it's a huge massive sample. And the poll essentially asks them, how do you feel about all the institutions into which you come into contact, right? So, are you happy with the post office? Are you happy with the 7-Eleven? Are you happy? How do you feel as a consumer? And in every survey since 9/11, voters have said that they like and trust government more than they ever have. That has been the one consistent change in this survey. To the extent that in the last Customer Satisfaction Index, voters said they liked and trusted the IRS, that would be the armed part of the government that takes your money by force every April 15th. They liked the IRS and trusted the IRS as about as much as they trust and like Northwest Airlines. And they like and trust the IRS more than McDonald's. So what does this tell you, apart from the obvious point that voters are sick and perverse? It tells you that maybe the Republican Party is going to need to sort of rethink, or in any case, refine its message, or in some way respond to this, because it's sort of a big deal if you think about what the base, the core, the fundamental Republican message is, and has been since 1980 at least, is, of course, we're the party that will save you from government. The government, ever-growing, ever-expanding, ever-metastasizing government is the single largest threat to your pocketbook, to your future, to your happiness, to the future of your children, etc. And the Republican Party has essentially said in every national campaign, most statewide campaigns, most local campaigns, has said, we're the party that will save you from this great threat, the single greatest threat, government. And it's worked, because it's true. But what happens all of a sudden if voters, or a larger number of voters, no longer feel as threatened by the size and growth of government? Well, you need to think of something new to run on, or you need to convince voters or reconvince them that, in fact, government is the problem. Or in some way, you have to respond to this fairly profound shift in attitude. And I'm not sure the party has. So I think there's a long-term problem. In the short term, there's also a problem because the debate about issues changes completely once you're no longer arguing about the role and size of government, right? So if you're not arguing about the role of government, what are you arguing about? You're arguing about stuff, right? I'll just give you a great example, and I could give you 1,000 examples. The debate over the prescription drug benefit. What is the debate? Well, the debate is really obvious. That no matter where you stand on the subject, you recognize, or would recognize, I think, that the debate is, should the federal government be providing this benefit? Does the Constitution imply some sort of guarantee to older Americans that the federal government's going to pick up, a portion of your prescription drug bill? That's the core debate. Again, no matter where you stand on, no matter where you come down on it, I think you would agree that's the argument. I'm struck by the fact that argument is not taking place. It's taking place on Crossfire. There may be some, far-out, wacko libertarian congressional district in like Idaho or something where people are arguing this, and good for them. But on the Hill, that's not the debate. The debate is solely about how much, with both parties promising basically to give a more generous or more efficient, which is another way of saying generous, benefit, right? That's the argument, essentially. It's not a philosophical argument. Again, it's an argument about stuff. Well, that's fine, except that's always an argument that Republicans are likely to lose. Why? Well, because Democrats simply have a more plausible case if the argument is who's going to give you more. In other words, if two candidates come to you, a Republican and a Democrat, both promising you more stuff, I don't care who you. I don't care if you're as conservative as I am. You're going to believe the Democrat. You just are. You know, if the question is, you know, how much more government goodies am I going to give you, the Democrat just has more credibility always on that question. So, in my opinion, the Republican Party has sort of set itself up philosophically, if not for a fall, then for a pretty rough road ahead, because it's allowed itself to be sucked into an argument where it stands at just a profound disadvantage. So at this point, now that I've predicted gloom for the Republican Party, the obvious question is, well, if that's true, then why have Republicans been doing so well lately? Why did they have this kind of amazing performance in the November midterms? Well, there are a bunch of different reasons. Let me just give you a couple of them. One, obviously, is that most voters trust and like the president. But I think a bigger reason is the obvious one, that the Democratic Party is in maybe deeper disarray, I think, than people realize. And part of that is simply because there's no Democratic leader right now. And so before Republicans get too excited and believe that we're going to see another decade of sort of a Nancy Pelosi-run Democratic Party, which, by the way, would be wonderful, you know, there will be a Democratic presidential candidate at some point, and he will be, at that point, the leader of his party, and the party will coalesce around him and will become a lot more consistent and a lot tougher, et cetera. That said, it really has been remarkable, just as an observer, to me anyway, to watch just how confused and how out of it and how ineffective Democrats have been. I mean, if you think about the midterm election, every survey, all the surveys we did at CNN showed that in early November, late October, the single biggest concern of voters was, of course, the economy. So how hard is it, if you're a political consultant, to tie an incumbent president to a weakening economy? It shouldn't. I mean, that's politics 101. That shouldn't be difficult at all. But instead, and Democrats attempt it, but if you listen to the Democratic arguments attempting to tie the president to the economy, they really sort of boil down to, literally, to Harvey Pitt. Harvey Pitt's a corrupt guy, and he's fat. Therefore, the Republicans can't be trusted on the economy. People said that on my show like every night. Harvey Pitt, bad, Harvey Pitt. And I remember thinking, not that it's my job to give advice to Democrats. I'm not a very active Democrat, as you may know. But my question was, well, I wonder how many voters, if you took a survey, have any clue who Harvey Pitt is or care that he's fat. And I wonder, of those who do know who he is, how many people really believe that staff changes at the SEC are going to have any effect on the economy at all. It was an insane argument and very ineffective, completely abstract, and kind of weird. But that was really the sum of the Democratic argument against the president's stewardship of the economy. The second issue, and one that I think is almost morally, not almost, it is morally problematic, of course, was the war. So the argument about the war, like the argument about prescription drugs, is really clear. The president said at the very beginning, we need to take out Saddam Hussein, we need to effect regime change, because Saddam Hussein is an imminent threat to the United States, to our national security. That's a pretty clear argument. Now, people come down on both sides. I actually have some conservative friends who don't agree with that, and who are, or have been, against the war because they don't believe that Saddam Hussein is a threat. I do think he's a threat, but I think it's a completely honorable, it's not necessarily an unpatriotic position to say, I conclude he's not, and therefore I don't think we ought to go to war. Some people have concluded that. But again, that argument, that central core argument, didn't take place. Why? Because Democrats didn't make that argument. Instead, they spent the entire, the Democratic arguments against the war were, well, Luxembourg, very uncomfortable with this. And the Belgians, the Belge, they don't like it either, and they're made very nervous by the exercise of American power and by the whole cowboy pose of the president. And then, of course, the French. I'm not a psychiatrist, though. Of course, I play one on television. But I was always struck by the French position in that it seemed to me to be what shrinks call transference. Right? So it was everything it was accusing its opponents of being. So French foreign policy was everything the French accused American foreign policy of being. Arrogant, unilateral, oil-driven. That was a perfect description of the French position on Iraq. And yet somehow, and I really don't think I'm reducing this unfairly, somehow liberals couldn't get over the fact that the French were against us. I don't know if it's the wine and cheese connection. I'm not sure what accounts for it psychologically. But at the end of the argument, the Democratic side was summed up by, well, if a couple countries in Western Europe aren't for it, I'm not for it either. That's not a powerful, in my opinion, that's not even a legitimate argument against the war in Iraq. It amounted to a complete abdication, in my opinion, of the responsibility Democrats had to mount a principled opposition, or a principled support, for that matter. Joe Lieberman, I think, has articulated a consistent and principled position in favor of the war with Iraq, with some very annoying political overtones, but fundamentally, I think, a consistent position. But most Democrats, even those who voted for the resolution, never really explained why. So I think, if there's anybody here who's against the war, and I'm not sure there is, but if anybody here is against the war, I think you can partly blame Democrats because they shirked their responsibility. And more than that, as it's sort of ground on, Democrats went to motive, which is always, in my opinion, one of the great pitfalls in politics. And I say that as someone who goes to the question of motive all the time in a pretty unfair way, but it's not my job to be fair. But you heard Democrats say, well, literally, the president wants to remove Saddam Hussein because it's payback for what Saddam did to his father. This sort of complicated, sort of confusing psychological explanation, because Saddam attempted to assassinate his father, and that's why we're going to war. I sort of thought for a second, well, wait a second. If a foreign leader attempts to assassinate an American president, I don't care which American, I don't care if it's Jerry Ford or Bill Clinton, you attempt to assassinate an American president, it seems to me you should lose your job. I mean, I didn't even bother making that argument on television because, it was so off the point, where you heard liberals mutter darkly. You hear them muttering darkly today to the effect that this is a war for oil, which is almost not even worth responding to. It's so dumb. The idea that the United States would need to send 300,000 men to the Persian Gulf in order to get favorable oil contracts with Iraq, that's insane. And then, of course, you heard, much more troublingly, Democrats say, my own congressman, Jim Moran, say out loud, this is a conspiracy. The Jews are doing this. This is literally a conspiracy of the handmaidens of Israel pushing America into war to benefit Israel. I'm just struck by the fact you can actually say things like that out loud now and not get immediately booted out of Congress. But I guess my congressman is proof that you can. And then, of course, since the war has begun, you've had Democrats always say, well, nobody's allowed to criticize the war. Or else, he's immediately denounced as unpatriotic. That's a complete straw man. I'm struck by all the sort of aggressively unpatriotic things that have been said since the war, and nobody seems to care. I mean, the day before the bombing started, Pete Stark, congressman from California, denounced the war as, quote, an act of terrorism. The United States government is committing an act of terrorism against Iraq. I happen to see him say that, so I know that he said it. But I'm struck I have not heard a single person mention that. Are you allowed to say that now? Nicholas DeGenova, a professor at Columbia University last week, got up at a rally, doubtless you all have seen this, or maybe you haven't, and that's even more interesting, and said, quote, he hoped for 1 million Mogadishus in Iraq, which is another way of saying, I hope American soldiers are slaughtered and tortured and dragged through the streets. This is a Columbia University professor at a rally the very next day in San Francisco. There was a massive banner calling for American soldiers to murder their officers in the street. People were carrying this banner, and I just thought, gee, I thought two things. One, again, it's striking that none of this gets covered with the kind of aggression I think it needs to be covered with. And second, where are the leaders of the Democratic Party to sort of corral their followers or their sympathizers and sort of cool them down? And where are the credible Democrats standing up and denouncing this kind of behavior? I mean, if some conservative member of Congress, if Ron Paul from Texas or some other conservative member got up and, say, denounced the Jews or called for the murder of American soldiers, I suspect, this is just a guess, it would be treated as a big deal. And I also suspect that Tom DeLay and people like him would immediately denounce it as unacceptable and drum that character out of the party immediately. At least I hope that. And if they didn't, I think I'd switch my registration to Libertarian. because I don't think I would want to be affiliated with a party that would put up with that kind of nonsense. Anyway, this is a very long way, and I'll stop in a second and take your questions, because you can ask my children. I can literally talk forever. But I do think that the disarray of the Democratic Party is one of the reasons you haven't seen Republicans hurt by this sort of very large change in voter attitudes. The second reason, and this is probably obvious to everyone in this room, not obvious, I think, to a lot of other people, that the president is just pretty skilled politically. And so if your experience of President Bush is watching him on television, struggling with this language we call English, I think, a lot of people say, well, this person has trouble pronouncing words. He doesn't know what he's doing. This, needless to say, is a vast underestimation of the man and his ability. In fact, he's a very capable, inspired, and natural political operator, essentially. And for a bunch of different reasons, a lot of them obvious. Governing rhetorically from the middle, appropriating the rhetoric of the other side. I mean, all the sort of tricks that really good politicians use. He also has, I must say, one quality that every really good politician I've ever covered has, and it's not something you can learn. It's an instinctive ability, and it's this. It's the ability to walk into a room, any room this size, and just instinctively know, to smell, almost like a dog smells, who hates you most, and focus all your attention on winning that person over. Clinton actually had this ability. It was hard for him because there were so many people to choose from. But Bush has this. I remember I first saw this for the first time in 98 or 99 in Texas, and some magazine, I think now defunct Quarterly magazine, had sent me out to profile George W. Bush, and so I was like the only reporter with him, and we were traveling outside Waco, and I think a town called Hillsborough, though I'm not sure. Anyway, those of you from Texas know what a huge deal it is when the governor of Texas visits your town. It's like the Pope, In Protestant towns, it's a bigger deal than the Pope visiting your town. And we were in this outdoor shopping center at about 10:30 in the morning, and there was a massive crowd. Must have been 500 people with signs jumping up and down and yelling. And I was sort of bored, and I was trying to figure out what's the criterion Bush uses to greet, every seventh person. We'd be walking along, and he'd, reach his hand out to every seventh person. What do these people have in common? This was my sort of mind exercise for the morning as I was tagging along behind Bush. And I look up ahead, and there's a guy standing in this crowd who clearly just did not fit in, who clearly had wandered here completely by accident. It was a guy about 19. He had a beer in his hand. He had obviously been walking from one event to another and sort of walked into the middle of this rally and couldn't get out. And he had like a tank top, undershirt on, long scraggly hair, a goatee, had these tattoos from his shoulder to his wrist, and pretty heavy-duty tattoos, like, snakes and death's heads, and snakes coming out of death's heads, and flames, and, like, profanity, and, pretty serious tattoos. And this guy did not want to meet President Bush or Governor Bush at all. He looked like he had to have a panic attack. He wanted to leave, but he couldn't because these people behind him, "Oh, Governor Bush," like that, And this guy's got his beer, and he's trying to get out of there. And Bush sees him and just locks onto this guy like a heat-seeking missile, and just goes right up to him. The guy's looking panicked. Bush walks right up, grabs his arm by the elbow, pulls it in, and says, "Nice tattoos. Where'd you get them done?" And this guy, it was like watching a faith healer. Be healed. He just went limp. "I love you, Governor Bush." He was totally overwhelmed by Bush. And later I thought, this is a metaphor for how Bush deals with Congress. I mean, Congress isn't very big. And if you are attempting to get your legislative package through, how many people do you have to do the faith healing routine on? Not that many, right? And not everyone's susceptible to it. Ted Kennedy is not going to be wowed by you, something I think that the president has learned, and good for him. But there are some members who will be. And so next time you hear some sort of super smart pollster or political consultant say, retail politics is dead, none of it means anything anymore, personality doesn't matter, it's all about, what's the famous Bob Shrum line, a political rally these days is 4 people around a television set watching an ad. All kinds of clever remarks like that de-emphasize the role of personal charisma in politics. It's totally wrong. It's totally stupid. It still matters in politics. The personal exchange with voters, and in governing, in the process of being president, it's a big deal. It can have a huge effect on your ability to get your program through Congress. A good friend of mine who's a White House correspondent for a major news organization once said to me, and a person who has much more respect for Bush than he did in the election of 2000, just watching him every day, he said, the key to Bush is that he actually gets done what he says he's going to get done. If the White House says we're going to do this, we're going to, basically, for instance, the ABM treaty, which when Bush first said, well, the ABM treaty is sort of outdated, and it was signed when, the Vietnam War was in progress, and it sort of holds America back. Every kind of intelligent foreign policy guy at Brookings said, well, you can't ignore the ABM treaty. That's the backbone of American foreign policy, basically. And Bush did. And when was the last time you read a story, an outraged story about the United States ignoring the ABM treaty? You don't, because this president was able to convince Congress. He was able, to some large extent, to convince the public, and to convince, maybe most important, Vladimir Putin, that ignoring the ABM treaty was actually not a threat to world peace, and in fact that we needed to do it. But the point is, it was done, I would say, a lot of conservatives have been against the ABM treaty for 25 years or more. So the idea was not revolutionary, but the ability to carry it off without a massive fuss was, if not revolutionary, then at least a profound testament to this president's political ability. And Democrats hate to admit that he's good in the way that Bill, in addition to everything else he is or is not, that he's good at politics. Because, Democrats still cling, to Clinton. Well, sure, he had some personal problems, but he was really a brilliant politician. Well, I guess I would submit to you that this president, despite appearances sometimes, is a brilliant politician too, and it matters, and that's why he's succeeding. Anyway, I'm going to stop here and take your questions because, again, I can go on forever. Yes, ma'am.
We are at war.
Yes, ma'am.
As a veteran, I am seeing a comparison. However, now the press is right in with the troops. Press and the media are giving us an instantaneous playout.
Yes.
How do your sponsors react, and to what extent does your panel have input into what you do and the image that you are presenting? You're influencing our youth. You have an obligation and a responsibility to influence morals, virtues, etc. Your opposition are devoid of any social amenities. They are arrogant, self-serving, do not even give you and Bob Novak an opportunity to speak. I've taken on Baghdad myself on a 1-to-1. He did not win.
Okay, well, maybe you should take my job.
I'll take the money.
Okay.
But now, you have an obligation. What input do you as panelists have? And if you don't, what are you going to do? Because you have an obligation to influence our young people, and we have many young people right after.
Okay, I'll try to answer questions quickly. It's to the last one first. What influence do we have as hosts of the show? It's our show, and so we don't debate things we don't want to debate. I don't debate anything I don't believe. I don't take a position I don't personally support, and would never do that. Life's too short, to lie on TV like that. As to your point that my co-hosts are rude, yeah, they're rude. Your question about our sponsors, how do our sponsors react to the war in Iraq? CNN is covering the war in Iraq with something like 30 reporters, not to mention crews and all the technical support people, and there are many for every reporter. About 30 of them in the field at great expense, and we're losing millions of dollars every single day, which we'll never get back because many of our sponsors have dropped out, having nothing to do, I think, with our coverage, but simply there are a lot of companies that don't want to advertise during war. So there are many things wrong with CNN. A lot of them are obvious probably to you as a viewer. But I would say, in defense of CNN and other networks, that they're doing this. It's not selfless exactly. Nothing in television is selfless, but they're they're not making money doing it. And I think it is a public service when reporters risk their lives. I mean, statistically, it's much more dangerous to be a reporter in war than a soldier. I mean, a far higher, many times higher percentage of reporters are killed in wars and have been for the last 50 years than soldiers. I mean, that's just a fact. And so reporters, you may not like them, but they do risk their lives to bring you the news, and I think that's admirable. The New York Times man in Baghdad, John Burns, who, unlike many people who work for the Times, is not a liberal and is not towing the Saddam line, has been filing stories every single day from Baghdad denouncing Saddam Hussein and comparing him to Stalin. On the front page of the New York Times. At incredible personal risk to himself. So I think that's admirable. There are many things about the coverage of the war that are shallow and lacking in perspective and kind of stupid, but then there's a lot about television that's shallow and lacking in perspective and stupid, so it's really no surprise. So I think the best our correspondents in the field, the 30-odd guys we have there, can do is what the Pentagon wanted them to do. And the reason, the purpose they're there for in the first place, which is to show you the war as it happens. And I think they're doing a pretty good job. And just one other thing, I would say that this administration has done something really brave in allowing reporters access to engagements. It's remarkable. It hasn't happened since the Second World War, obviously, and even then it was not done in the systematic way it's been done now. I got a call from someone at the White House 2 days ago asking me, and I'm still trying to do it, and we'll see if it works, if I wanted to go on an operation in northern Iraq with Special Forces guys. And I thought, well, that's incredible. I mean, 2 years ago, no reporter was allowed anywhere near any of that stuff. And the administration has done it knowing that it's going to hurt them, potentially in the short term. I mean, there was this tragedy 2 days ago in Iraq where civilians were killed at a roadblock. And there was a Washington Post reporter who witnessed the entire event. And many of you read it on the front page of the Post, the William Brannigan piece. Kind of amazing. That hurts the administration, but they're allowing reporters to cover it and chronicle it for history anyway, and I hope they get a lot of credit for that. Yes, sir.
Will we get bogged down? Will, as General Brooks this morning said, will we drive the dagger through the heart of the Iraqi regime? And if so, how long will it take?
No clue to all of the above. I have no idea, and I must say I'm so tempted to say, to attack those who said it'll be a cakewalk, because I didn't believe them. It's easy to say that now. I know it sounds like I'm revising my opinion, but I always thought that was glib and dumb and sort of offensive. A week, the question was how long is it going to take? And my answer is I don't know. I'm very struck, though, that, famously Ken Edelman, a very nice guy and a regular on Crossfire, and Richard Pearl, same applies to him, both implied or said this is going to be really easy, it's going to be the next six-day war, et cetera, and they've taken a lot of grief for saying that. But little remembered is that the single loudest voice pushing that point of view, Bill Clinton. Who, you all know this because you're better informed than most people, but most people I don't believe do know that. That in two different speeches right before this war, Clinton said in this sort of offhanded way, I think, quote, I will be shocked, amazed, if this goes longer than a week. There is a certain arrogance and dumbness in that. And that's also, I'm not sure, quite appropriate to say that, for a former president to say that right before war. But that, nothing he does is appropriate, so I guess that ought not to be a surprise. But I think it could, I think I think the obvious, which is, A, we don't really know, B, the potential for it to last a long time is absolutely there. And friends of mine who are traveling with troops, and I hate to say this, but report that all these media report. The press has such a dumb instinct to kind of pile on and go with the cliche of the moment. And the cliche of the moment is no one prepared us for how difficult this could be, right? I have to say, though, friends of mine who are traveling with troops right now, conservative friends of mine, tell me that that's true. That feeling, that's not simply the Times editorial page saying that. That there are commanders in the field who feel that way. So, I don't know. Yes, sir.
Do you have any observations on the situation in Afghanistan and North Korea?
Well, I guess just the obvious. Well, North Korea is a. You know, I do know that there's I have a couple of them really quickly. Most of them are sort of banal and obvious. My favorite, the most amusing argument against going to war in Iraq, I thought in the lead-up was, I didn't mention this one, was, well, North Korea says, or has, we believe North Korea has nuclear weapons. Why aren't we going after North Korea? Well, of course, that's exactly the point, is North Korea has nuclear weapons, and, you know, that's why we don't want Iraq to get nuclear, you know, because once a country has nuclear weapons, then, you know, you must say please. I do know this is interesting. Someone I spoke to who works over there being in the White House, said to me the other day that there is a strong push from conservatives within the White House to remove from South Korea, from the DMZ area, the whatever 37,000 American troops who were there. And the feeling is that South Koreans are ungrateful, and moreover, if North Korea made a move against the South, they would be killed. And so we ought to remove the American troops from South Korea. That's a big, I mean, Jimmy Carter suggested that, you know, in 1977, and threw the entire region into this massive panic, as you may remember, and then had to take it back. I don't know if that's actually going to happen. I have no idea even what I think of that. But that tells you that people in the White House are getting, and this wasn't some, this wasn't an employee in the White House mess. This was a guy who makes policy said this to me. So that gives you some sense of how frustrated they are with the South Korean government. I think it's potentially bad. The other thing about South Korea rather than North Korea that no one ever writes about is that North Korea is one of the main reasons we have a new $100 bill. And one of the main reasons we're getting a new $20 bill, because North Korea is the single largest counterfeiter in the world, which is sort of a big deal. I mean, I talked to someone at Treasury once who said that there are estimates floating out there that a third or a half of all $100 bills in circulation around the world are counterfeit, and that a lot of them are made in North Korea. If you think about the amount of American currency in circulation around the world and how central that currency, the physical, the bills, how central those bills are to the world economy, that's not an overstatement. The idea that if somehow it became a common belief that those were counterfeit, that would have a huge effect on the way the whole world works. So it's potentially scary and destabilizing, just the counterfeiting. North Korea is also the single largest manufacturer of methamphetamine in the world, which it moves in diplomatic pouches around the world. So there are a lot of things about North Korea that are really, really destabilizing, and I just can't imagine that the U.S., the Bush administration, won't address them directly before long. I think we would have to, leaving aside even the nuclear weapons. So, yes?
What do you think the future of the relationship between the United States and the United Nations will be, and what role do you think the United Nations should play in the restructuring of Iraq? And also, if you can comment on the future effectiveness of the United Nations on the world scene.
The question is, what does the UN, what happens to the UN now? And I sort of buy, I have the conventional reactionary right-wing feelings about this. I'll be totally honest with you. To heck with the UN. That is my gut feeling about all this. But I'm very struck, so I won't even bore you with all that. But I am struck by Colin Powell, who's obviously a great instinctive believer in multilateralism, who was a great skeptic of the war in Iraq, and who I think in obviously a heartfelt way, changed his mind a couple of months, not even very long ago. He was, we read all these news stories, and as far as I know from reporting I've done, they're accurate, that there was this battle, or battle of the words anyway, between Rumsfeld and Powell switched. The explanation that I've heard people give is that Powell, as a believer in multilateralism and as a supporter of the United Nations, was upset to see the United Nations be as ineffective as it was and as ludicrous as it was. And so this is a long way of saying, if you love the United Nations, you think it needed the spanking it got, right? And people like Powell and people who see a role for the UN in world affairs going forward, I think, believe with some evidence that the UN will be more effective now that it's been called on its propensity to pass resolutions with no intention of acting on them, right? But I think I'm not a huge believer in the UN, so my personal opinion is that the Bush did a brave thing, that over the past 20 years it's kind of been, the polls on this were really, really clear. People wanted the United Nations to agree. that was the one constant in all the polling we did at CNN, was that no matter how you felt about the war, something like 75% of Americans really thought it was important that the United Nations agree with what we were doing. I don't know why. No one I knew thought it was important that they agree, but again, I've got a small circle of friends. But the average person really believed it was important. And Bush knew that. They do a ton of polling at the White House, as you know, and they were fully aware of that, and they went forward anyway. So very, very bold. And, he basically made the case that if you think that you need to do something in order to protect your country, how can you allow the opinions of other countries to get in the way of it? I think everyone can understand that rationale. So, I don't really...
One more question.
Yes.
Through talk shows, the internet, and new television channels, conservative voices have been heard much more now than 15 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
What do you see as the dynamic for that in the future? Will it continue? Will it subside? Will it stay about the same?
The question is, will there are many more open conservatives in the media? And will that continue, and why is that? And I think it will continue. It's very, very interesting. There's a new book out by Eric Alterman, who's a quite left-wing, very bitter, angry man, too, journalist, who, and it's called something like, the myth of the liberal media. And it basically makes the point that, hold on, before we call the media liberal, there are a lot of right-wingers in it. And he's right, and it's interesting. I mean, the press clearly is liberal. I mean, the average reporter is not the same as the average talk show host. More talk show hosts are conservative, but your average reporter is still liberal. But it does raise a really interesting question. Why are so many talk show hosts conservative? Why are the most successful, there is no left-wing, well, Hannity and Combs is a great example. Poor Alan Combs. I think that show's unwatchable. I don't watch it, but I know those guys, and I always feel, much as I don't agree with them, I always feel sorry for Alan Combs. He always looks like he got hit in the head really hard with something. But anyway, but there are very few liberals. I'm not exactly sure why. There are tons of theories about this. One is that most viewers of cable news are conservative, and the conservatives tend to be better informed than liberals and just more interested in news, and they don't want to watch the Phil Donahues of the world. The second theory is that after many years on the outside, conservatives have been sort of forced to think through their positions more, and that they have a kind of outside looking in sensibility, a more maverick sensibility that's appealing on television. And the third theory, and the one I ascribe to, is that their arguments just kind of happen to make sense. And so let's say you were an opponent, a liberal opponent of the war, and you were getting up every day and saying, France isn't for this. That's not a very interesting argument in the end. It's not only dumb, it doesn't really go anywhere. And so I just think there's a lack of engaging, interesting liberal ideas. That will absolutely change. Of course. I mean, 50 years ago, how many interesting conservative thinkers were there? Some, not that many, right? So Lionel Schilling wasn't, a right-winger, and neither was, Cyril Connolly or whatever. Things change. And there may be a rebirth of liberal ideas, but at the present moment, I can't really think of a single interesting liberal idea. Maybe you can. Anyway, no, you can't. Okay, good. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks. I'm going to split. I got to go. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tucker. What an interesting, fascinating presentation that you make, and we can see why you have a big fan club. Conservatives for decades have described something called Potomac fever, and the process is that when a conservative comes to Washington, he turns left. The liberal media encourage that in many ways, and when someone who is conservative comes to Washington and turns left, they say that that person has grown. Well, I have to say, Tucker, that you came to Washington and you didn't turn left, and in fact, you get better and better as a conservative, and I've never seen And I certainly don't expect ever to see a story in the Washington Post saying that Tucker Carlson has, in that context, grown. In our context, you are growing, and we are absolutely delighted. Now, Tucker, you should know that it is our tradition at the Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast to give Adam Smith ties to our speakers. And when they're lady speakers, we give them an Adam Smith scarf. And we produce a wide variety of Adam Smith ties, but they're all ties that you tie with a four-in-hand or Windsor knot. However, knowing that you were coming, we had manufactured, especially for you, an Adam Smith bow tie, which I am happy to present to you as a token.
So nice.
As a
Thank
token.
you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I'll wear it. That's great looking.
Great. Well, we're happy to do that. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to come back and visit us again for this breakfast on Wednesday, May the 7th. Our special guest will be the executive director of the enormous and remarkably effective conservative organization, American Legislative Exchange Council, the coalition of conservative state legislators, which is quite excellent. His name is Dwayne Pardee. He's quite a good guy and doing a wonderful job. So come back then. Any of you who would like a tour of the building, if you would come right up here, I guess kind of over there, because I think some of you are going to want to come up and shake hands with Tucker. But Emily Geisler, who's our intern, will lead you on a tour, and you'll meet Emily here. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.